rest of you can stand, and we're going to go ahead and read God's word together. We are in a study on 1 Samuel, and so we're going to actually be looking at two chapters today, chapter 21 and 22, but I'm only going to read a snippet now, and then we're going to cover two chapters fairly quickly. So let's go ahead and read together. First, verses 1 through 5 in chapter 22, and then towards the end. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." And he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. You can have a seat. So if you're new, you've got a lot of catching up to do, and I'm not going to try to do it right now, but we do have all of the sermons online. If you were with us last week, we covered David's escape from the reigning king Saul. David, once masterful royal musician, a war hero, commander of Israel's national army, and the son-in-law of the king, is now a fugitive on the run. It reminds me of the hit 1993 thriller The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones. And I realized this week, this movie is over 30 years old, which makes me feel ancient. If you've not ever seen it, and I'm thinking Gen Y, Z, and millennials, do yourself a favor and go watch it. Now, if you don't like it, email all complaints to our cultural relevance expert, Josh, at eternalchurch.net. There's a great little speech that Tommy Lee Jones gives. He plays the U.S. Marshal Deputy Sam Gerard, the agent assigned to hunt down Harrison Ford's character who's wanted for murder. And upon arriving at the scene of a train wreck, he says, and I'm sorry for butchering the accent, "All right, listen up, ladies and gentlemen. Our fugitive has been on the run for 90 minutes. Average foot speed over uneven ground, barring injuries, is 4 miles per hour. That gives us a radius of 6 miles. What I want from each and every one of you is a hard target search of every gas station, residence, warehouse, farmhouse, hen house, outhouse, and doghouse in that area. Checkpoints go up in 15 miles. Your fugitive's name is Dr. Richard Kimball. Go get him." In today's passage, Saul's fugitive is David. And he doesn't want to just catch him, he wants to kill him. And when we read 1 Samuel, it might be easy for us to see Saul and David as two-dimensional characters. Saul is bad guy, David is good guy. Saul is disobedient to Yahweh. David is known by Yahweh as a man after my own heart. So moral of the story, don't be like Saul, be like David. Saul is the tyrant, David is the underdog, and we want to root for him. Even if the title man or woman after God's own heart might seem a little bit far-fetched for us today. But even though history and geography might make David feel distant from us, I'm seeing some similarities, and not great ones, between David's character and my own. He's more relatable than I feel comfortable to admit. And so in some ways, it might feel like, okay, maybe there's hope for me, or maybe these similarities are really not good. But let's find out together. We've got a fugitive on the run, so let's go get him and find out what's going on here. And though we only read 9 verses aloud this morning, we're covering all of chapters 21 and 22, and there's a lot there, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline. You might want to write this down, come back to it later. It's a loose scaffolding for what we're going to be covering. I told you a few weeks ago, you've got to read ahead in order to get it all, and I'm serious about that. But I wouldn't judge you if you think that this is just too much to cover. A few times this week, I've had the same thought. I actually spoke with the pastors about potentially adding an extra week. But the longer I sat with the text and studied the context, the more I realized that these two chapters are tied into each other in a beautiful and terrible symmetry. It starts with a seemingly insignificant three-letter word that acts as bookends to our text and potentially trips us up before we even get started. The word is knob. And there's a reason why I'm choosing to tackle these two chapters in this way. This passage is an example of something in Hebrew called an inclusio, or an envelope literary pattern. You could think of it as like bookends. One scholar calls it a broken construct chain, where the author, Samuel, breaks up the primary plot line, like A to B, and he inserts a few sub-stories to add context and slow down the story and build some suspense. So in this case, we start in the city of Nob in chapter 21, and we'll end up back in Nob in chapter 22. But we have these sub-stories of David fleeing to Gath and then escaping into the cave of Adullam in between. We'll call that X. So you've got an A, X, B kind of a structure. Now I'm giving you these director's cut notes here because I want you to see that while I might be breaking out of chronological order, so did the original author with a particular purpose in mind. So today we'll handle Nob first, and then I'll handle Gath, and then Nob part 2, and we'll come back to the cave to close. I know this is a little bit jumpy and a little bit sporadic, but I believe it best honors the text and the meaning for us today. So, remember, last week David had fled from Saul and taken refuge with his old prophet friend Samuel, the guy that had anointed him to be the next king. And when Saul caught wind of David's whereabouts, he sent messengers, or thugs, to get him. But the messengers got caught up in the spirit and started prophesying uncontrollably at Samuel's prophet school. And the same thing happened again 2 more times before Saul got so upset that he decided to take matters into his own hands and show up himself to give a message. But he shows up and he was himself caught up in the spirit and started spouting off prophecy, this time completely naked. Message received. Yahweh is in charge, Saul is not. And yet, despite this display of Yahweh's superior power and protection, David freaks out and flees in despair. I mean, God is clearly in control here, but David only saw the scary circumstances that surrounded him. Again, I've been that guy, probably recently. How about you? And so we start today in chapter 21, verse 1, and it says, Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? So Nob was a little town to the northeast of where Jerusalem would eventually be. Remember, it hasn't even been founded yet. They didn't have phones or internet or social media, so it's not likely that too many people knew that David and Saul had had a falling out and that now Saul was trying to kill him. David probably still enjoyed broad celebrity status among the people of Israel, and so it must have been jarring to have a heroic figure like David come into a small town unescorted by any troops or any fanfare. That's the only thing I can figure as to why this priest would be trembling. Can you imagine if Donald Trump or Kamala Harris just showed up at the peach stand without any Secret Service, any police escort, any fans? They just walk in the door alone. It would be really jarring. It would be unsettling. And then the good guy lies into a priest. This is so weird. He says something like, the king has me on a super top secret official business mission. I'd tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. We had to leave at a moment's notice. I've got a commando team hiding out in the woods, and we're in need of food. So give me what you've got. I mean, I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. It's obvious by this time that David considers Saul to be his enemy. In Psalm 11, when David is on the run, he writes, The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. He's talking about his father-in-law, Saul. So is this passage saying that lying is okay in certain circumstances? Is this passage condoning deception, distortion, manipulation? It kind of seems that way initially. And this is the hero. But the story isn't over yet, so don't rush to judgment. Ahimelech the priest explains that they don't have any bread other than what's designated for the official priestly duties. He bends the Levitical standard and extends this as an option, supposing that these commandos have remained ceremonial clean, or they haven't been with a woman recently. And David swears up and down that his soldiers are super squeaky clean. And he nearly blows it here, if you think about it, because if he and his crew were called to suddenly deploy at a moment's notice by the king, how could David ensure that all of his soldiers had not been with women? Apparently, the priest wasn't as concerned about these holes in the narrative as he was about how he could honor David's request. So he grants David 5 loaves of holy bread for the journey. And then, almost as an aside, David asks, "And do you have any weapons here?" We forgot our weapons, the commandos. Like I said, we were leaving in a hurry. David is a bad liar. This story is so thin. But Ahimelech, faithful to a fault, says, well, I don't have any weapons in the temple. Duh, it's not an armory. But we just so happen to have someone leave Goliath's sword here as a kind of Ebenezer, a sign of God's faithfulness for when we defeated him. When you defeated him, he said, would that work? And so no bread, but bread is provided. No weapon, but a sword is provided. Now, David has lied about being on a special secret mission from the king, but it's certainly starting to feel like he's on a mission from God, or at least getting unmerited provision and protection from somewhere. Verse 7 is a sort of parenthetical introduction to a minor character with a major role today. It says in verse 7, now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Doeg. You can go ahead and say that, Doeg. Even the name sounds ominous. It sounds like dog, mad dog. I envision a grizzly dude like Dog the bounty hunter, Doeg the bounty hunter. And to make matters worse, he's an Edomite. And if you don't remember, Edomites came from the line of Esau, from the fraternal drama between Jacob and Esau. Remember how Jacob, the second-born twin, cheated Esau, the firstborn twin, out of his birthright and blessing? How then Jacob went on to become Israel, and God would use he and his descendants to play out the redemptive story. What happened to Esau? Well, Esau and his descendants, the Edomites, became enemies of Israel. Like frenemies, but family enemies. So Doeg has an ominous name with ties to a dark family history with an unclear part to play in today's story. More on him soon. That's kind of the end of the intro, end of part A. So now let's go to that first inclusio, to Gath. It's almost like David is backing into decisions completely reactively, emotionally, not at all prayerfully. He's acting out of fear and not faith. Again, I'm seeing myself operating out of the flesh a lot here. While he had God's protection, he fled from Samuel and Ramah. He fled from his best friend Jonathan without a plan. He arrives in a temple in Nob and weaves together a fiction on the fly, and then stumbles on some supplies and sees the sword of Goliath and thinks, Goliath, yes, Gath. Saul will never be looking for me in enemy territory. It's a perfect plan, except it's like the worst possible plan. Hiding out in the city of the family of the friends of the oversized champion that you killed previously, that brought you fame and fortune, made you a hero. That's crazy. I'm going to go hide out with the family members of the guy I killed. It's so crazy that it just might work. So many of the plans that I have that don't consult God initially seem like wisdom to me, but then in hindsight, they play out and I realize exactly how dumb they were. And I'm just going to read you the whole account for this because I think it'll put it into better perspective. So verses 10 through 15, it says, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did not they sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior. Here we go again. He changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. And then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see this man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought me this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" With David, it's more fear, more flinching, more on-the-fly fiction. This time complete with a foaming mouth, maybe crazy eyes, and he's writing on the walls. You need to know that cultic religions in the ancient Near East were terrified by the mentally ill. So David's plan was crazy, but his acting was compelling. Again, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? It is survival. You got to give him credit for that, but it hardly seems like a man whose life is surrendered to Yahweh. His theatrics have the desired impact. He's escorted out of Gath. And it seems like every time David utters, "Man, I'm in a tight spot," somehow he finds a way out. Or somehow a way is provided despite his flailing. But for now, we're going back to the beginning, back to that story with Nob. We're going to get to part B. And in chapter 22, verse 6, Saul hears that David has been sighted somewhere in Judah, and he hits his boiling point. Listen to this pitiful speech that he gives not to an enemy, but to his own men. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, people of Benjamin," these are his own tribe, "will the son of Jesse," David, "give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as to this day." What a tantrum. What a victim. This sounds like a psalm of lament, not by David, but by Saul, his enemy. He takes no responsibility for rejecting Yahweh or for his intentions to kill the military leader and his son-in-law, even his own son, Jonathan. This is the blame game. Everyone's out to get him. Everyone is betraying him. He can't even bring himself to mention David by name. Did you catch that? Only as the son of Jesse. It's either an intended slight or he's so mad he can't even utter this guy's name in his mouth. And speaking of corruption, here comes Dog the return, Dog the Edomite. Just know how badly I want to say Dog the bounty hunter every time it happens. So Doeg comes back into the picture to tattle on David about what he saw at Nob. In verses 9 and 10, he says, "Then Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." All right, so I got to have a brief timeout here. We started today in Nob, and now we're back in Nob. And since I am apparently Eternal's resident scholar, thanks again for that, Josh, and for all that extra email this week. Since I'm the scholar, I want to call out something that might not be obvious, but it might just be important. We don't want to stub our toe on this Nob, because Nob wasn't really on the map of meaningful places. Yet the passage mentions a priest and holy bread, the bread of the presence. Remember, ancient Israel isn't exactly the Bible Belt at this time. There's not a temple on every street corner. Jerusalem doesn't even exist yet, so the temple hasn't been built. But there is the Ark of the Covenant, which was the presence of God, and the tabernacle, which was like the to-go temple, which houses it. And that's where the priests do their thing with the tabernacle. Now, the last place we heard about the Ark and the tabernacle was in a little town called Kiriath Jearim, back in 1 Samuel 6. The Philistines had stolen it in battle. Remember that the Philistines got sick because of the presence of the ark in their camp, and then they surrendered it back to Israel, accompanied by a really odd guilt offering for taking it. John Zimmer preached through this passage months ago. If you're curious or confused, I recommend you go back and re-listen to that. It's in chapter 6. So they returned it from Philistine territory to a place called Kiriath Jearim. And we read in chapter 7, verse 1, that the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill, and they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. This is where you got to pay attention. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. So the ark is in this town for a long time, some 20 years. So the question is, in our passage, chapters 21 and 22, is the ark in Nob or is it in Kiriath Jearim? People a lot smarter than me disagree on what's happening here. I honestly don't know for sure. I see two possibilities that I'll mention, but honestly, I can only make an educated guess. So either, number one, the ark was moved to Nob at Saul's request at some point earlier. And some people look to chapter 14, verse 18. If you want to go look it up this week, go for it. Or, number two, the ark remained at Kiriath Jearim until David officially became king and brought the ark to Jerusalem. And that doesn't happen until 2 Samuel 6 or 1 Chronicles 13. They both talk about it. And what this means is that the ark is not at Nob in our passage. Now, this is a complex, complicated issue involving textual variants between the ancient Hebrew, the Septuagint, the Masoretic texts, which scholars and pastors still disagree on to this day. People that I really respect are on both sides. So feel free to dig in deep this week and do some research and let me know where you land. But for the sake of simplicity and brevity, and to stick to our aim of knowing Christ and making him know, I'm just going to give you my guess. And that's what this is. It's an estimated guess. But I think that number two is true, that the ark remained at Kiriath Jearim and was still there during our passage in 1 Samuel 21 and 22. And now to the bigger question that I'm sure half of you are asking, who cares? Well, I think the original audience would have cared a whole lot. And therefore, I think that we should care. Because the original audience probably would have picked up on something really weird going on here. A priest with holy bread in a temple without the ark in Nob. What's the deal? Something doesn't add up. So track with me here. I don't believe that Israel is strictly operating at this time as a one nation under God, under Saul's rule. I credit Dr. Ron Johnson for this theory, this hypothesis. Saul had been appointed and anointed. He'd been chosen by Yahweh to be the first king, but the first king didn't reciprocate. He hadn't chosen Yahweh back. We see a few examples of this when Saul tells Samuel to do some things for the Lord your God. He doesn't call him the Lord my God. He says, do these things for the Lord your God. Samuel's God, not Saul's God. Saul also never hears back from Yahweh when he prays to him. A puzzling fact that will come into clear focus next week. Last week we saw that Saul's daughter, Michal, David's wife, helps David escape from Saul by putting her image, her teraphim, in his bed. And we might think, oh, this must have been like a mannequin or a dummy that they put under the sheets in order to make it look like David was sleeping. No, it says it was an image, as in a graven image, an idol, which was a no-no in the Ten Commandments. So Saul's own daughter was apparently an idol worshiper, and it stands to reason that since she grew up in her father's house, that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Add to that Saul offers sacrifices to God, but Samuel tells him that Saul's sacrifices are an abomination and basically equivalent to witchcraft. And you might think that, well, Samuel wasn't a prophet. That's obviously why he got into trouble. But actually, there's a few folks in the Old Testament who were not priests that offered sacrifices to Yahweh. People like Gideon the judge, like King David himself, or David's son, Solomon. They are not rebuked for sacrifices to Yahweh, but Saul is accused of witchcraft for doing the same thing. Now, maybe that's because Saul was offering sacrifices to God or gods, but not to Yahweh. And remember, Saul is initially, he gets a measure of the Spirit of the Lord, like the Spirit of Yahweh, when he's anointed. But from that point onward, when God is involved with Saul, it's in the Spirit of God, Elohim. It's a very Spirit of the Lord, Yahweh, Spirit of God, Elohim. It's an impersonal title, suggesting that Saul was being used more like a puppet rather than a partner and an ally with God. All this to say, and this is what we need to get from this, I don't think Saul knew or loved Yahweh. Saul was God's man, yes, technically, as a political position in the monarchy, but not as a man after God's heart. He doesn't worship the one true God. He's not a Yahwist, as scholars would call it. So with that lengthy backdrop, it's not all that shocking that perhaps some unsanctioned, unofficial temples have sprung up around Israel. Saul is the king of a divine monarchy. Samuel, the prophet, is retired as judge. He normally would have been the guy that would have corrected the wayward thinking, the wayward belief. But now the king makes religious things happen. Like in Nob, a temple there would be a lot closer to Gibeah, 2 miles away, and more convenient for Saul than if he had to go all the way to Kiriath Jearim, some 10 plus miles away, to worship. And it might make sense that the king would keep the vanquished sword of Goliath in this pseudo-temple as a sort of trophy for Israel's victory, really David's victory. This temple in Nob hints that the king and the kingdom may not be in lockstep with Yahweh at this point. Saul's syncretistic character is yielding a syncretistic people. That feels pretty on brand for Saul. And to be clear, well, his character allows for a good bit of flexibility in what or where to worship. It seems like Ahimelech and the priests are legit. Like they're real Yahweh worshipers. So now back to the story. With Doeg's report of Ahimelech helping David, Saul summons Ahimelech and all the priests to come to him in Gibeah. I remember elementary school when you had somebody come and interrupt the class and they say, "Excuse me, would Bobby please come with me to the principal's office?" And everybody would go, "Ooh." This is a call to the principal's office. Ahimelech and all the prophets from Nob are summoned to Saul. You can feel the tension building since the last chapter and coming to a climax here. So in verses 13 through 15, we read about this showdown. Saul said to him, "Why have you, Ahimelech, conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as at this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king, "And who among your servants is so faithful as David, who's the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little." Ahimelech is clueless as to what's going on. Saul doubles down on his distorted claims, but Ahimelech responds with the whole truth and even tried to remind the king of just how special David is to him. Little did Ahimelech know that even uttering the word David was probably his death sentence. Saul couldn't handle the truth because it was getting in the way of his goals. He commands his soldiers to kill all the priests. And in an amazing example of civil disobedience, Saul's own soldiers refuse to obey the mad king. They're not just following orders. This is so inspiring and so ironic, okay? Flashback to when God first rejected Saul. Do you remember what happened? It was back in chapter 15. God had given Saul a command. He said, "Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have, the Amalekites. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." And what does Saul do? Verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. So you see, he did exactly what God told him not to do. He left some people alive and he kept the good stuff for himself. And now, in an ironic twist, Saul commands his soldiers to kill Ahimelech and the priests and devote the priests of Yahweh to destruction, to wipe them out. And like Saul had previously done, his soldiers now disobey this command from the mad king. But he won't be stopped. He outsources the dirty deed to, you guessed it, Doeg, an Edomite, the enemy of God. 85 priests put to the sword. And then to finish the job, as if that wasn't bad enough, we read in verse 19, and Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, the whole city. Both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, he put to the sword. He's using the same language here as he did previously in chapter 15. So the king who first defied Yahweh's command now destroys Yahweh's priests and people. Y'all, this guy is not a Yahwist. He does not worship the one true God. The king is acting like a criminal. And then we go to our final inclusio, which I'm putting at the end, and you'll see why. It seems like we're cruising to kind of a bleak, depressing conclusion. How does the story end? Do the bad guys win? Not so fast. Not as all as it seems. Some of you might recall in J.R.R. Tolkien's poem, The Riddle of Strider. It's beautiful. It says, all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. Tolkien could have just as easily been talking about David as about his character Strider, who some of you may know that is also a dark, roguish figure, looks like an outlaw, but actually is an unexpected royal destiny in front of him. Okay, so finally, David stops running. He crawls into a cave. He falls down before Yahweh. He calls out for help. In the cave of Adullam, David stops running and turns back to Yahweh. And an interesting thing happens here. He's safe, but he's no longer alone. His family somehow hears where he's hiding out and they journey to join him. I'm guessing that they think that since their son David's not safe, and since Saul's own son Jonathan isn't safe, that probably they might have a bounty on their head. But it's not only David's family that shows up. All sorts of distressed, displaced, indebted, outcasts, and outlaws come into the middle of nowhere to find a place to belong. Something resonated among this little misfit community. And don't mistake this cave for like a little hole in the ground. You'd be more accurate to think of this as like the home of the dwarves in Tolkien's books. This is a massive, gargantuan space. Initially, 400 men and probably women and children came and holed up there for a little bit. Eventually, this number grew to more like 600, and they would become what the Bible knows as David's Gibborim, or mighty men of valor. So something special was happening in the middle of the wilderness, in a cave, in a stronghold, the same word here for Masada. Well, the mad king is killing his own priests and leading his subjects into syncretistic worship. Yahweh is establishing an outlaw as the new king and renewing outlaws, outcasts, and outsiders as its unlikely citizens. Like Saul, David had previously acted out of fear and self-preservation instead of by faith and trust in God's providence. Honestly, if you look at their behavior, you can't really tell one from the other. They both are messy. So I think at the end of the day, It boils down to, who do these guys worship? David is now seeing things from God's perspective. He remembers who he is and whose he is. The last stanza of Psalm 52, the one, by the way, that's actually aimed at Doeg the Edomite, if you can see it in the inscription of Psalm 52. But he says this at the very end. He says, "But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever. I will thank you forever because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of the godly." Instead of running, David is finally waiting. He's wanting to hear from the voice of God. He's not just trying to rely on his own resources, his speed, his cunning, his ability to lie and trick and deceive. As David's faith in Yahweh is renewed and restored, God's kingdom is renewed and restored. There is hope, even in the face of monstrous darkness. And then chapter 22 ends with a little hinge scene to the next chapter. A single man had escaped from Nob, Ahimelech, the priest's son, Abiathar. And he found David in the wilderness. He told David what happened to his father, the 85 priests, and all the citizens and livestock in Nob. But instead of doing what I probably would have done, instead of David getting defensive or paranoid and running off again, David admits that his lies had led to the death and destruction of a whole city. He sees his sin and the consequences because he's already stopped, dropped, and repented in the stronghold. Now, there might not be a conventional apology to Abiathar, but here he does start to make amends. He says something like, "Stay with me. Your life is in danger. The same one who's pursuing me is pursuing you. But if you stay with me, I'll keep you safe." This has echoes of Jesus. Remember, he said, "If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. And in this world, you will have trouble. But what? Take heart, I have overcome the world." There's so much in these two chapters that foreshadows Jesus Christ. If you think about it, Jesus too was a king who was treated like a criminal. Those in authority at the time, the Pharisees, Herod, the Romans, they were consistently operating out of control, self-preservation, and intentionally bending the truth to serve their own aims. Jesus was an outcast who attracted and communed with outcasts, the sick, tax collectors, prostitutes, all sorts of sinners. This distant relative of King David said that God's kingdom, the one started back in Samuel, was now being renewed again. And it too would be filled with unlikely citizens, the poor in spirit, those mourning, the meek, the ones who crave God's righteousness, those who show mercy, the pure of heart, the peacemakers, and the ones who were victim to unrighteousness. And unlike any prior earthly king or any since, this king didn't run or hide or scheme or lie. He didn't try to keep his crown, but in humility, he left heaven, left the throne room, and became human. He lived for the truth. And for the joy set before him, he endured death on a cross so that all of his subjects wouldn't be subjected to the penalty of sin. And good news, the kingdom he's building, the kingdom he was renewing, is still being filled with outcasts, outsiders, and outlaws today. Folks like us. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word. There's a lot. And if there's anything here that gets in the way of knowing who you are or what you've done or knowing Christ and making him known, then we ask that it falls away. But Lord, if it helps us to see you and understand you and know you and love you more, then Lord, we ask that you continue to work that into us. And I wonder this morning if there's anybody running like David was running, relying on his own resources, trying to make up a plan, trying to make things work on his own terms according to his own wisdom, just kind of flailing and failing from one step to the next. And Lord, I just pray if there is, I've been that guy before, I just pray that this moment would be a cave. That we might find ourselves stopping, dropping, calling out to you, God, I don't have the ability to keep running. I don't have the ability to make up the plan for my life. I don't want that job. I want to trust you. I want to know you. I want you to speak to me. God, I pray in a cave, in a stronghold, in a fortress, you would be our strength. You would be our security. You would be our safe place. And that by slowing down and seeking you, we might remember who we are and whose we are. And we might find real safety and security. Thank you for your word, Lord. Continue to whisper to us this week. We love you and we ask these things in your name and for your glory. Amen.